At the COP27, UN Secretary General Guterres asserted that we are on a highway to climate hell and still have our foot on the gas pedal. This image seems apt for our conversation on the recent International Council on Clean Transportation proposal for cleaning up Germany's vehicle stock. When implemented, it will constitute a new best practice in removing our foot from that gas pedal and moving on to the exit ramp. My name is Bruce Murray, retired Illinois and Vienna Programs Director and co-initiator of its Global Sustainability Certificate Program. During the fall of 2024, I have had the privilege to interact with Max Zhu. Max is an Illinois engineering major and GSCP participant currently enrolled in a Vienna University of Technology course on mediated architecture, for which today's conversation is a key assignment. Max will lead the conversation with Kyle Morrison, ICCT researcher and co-author of Cleaning Up Germany's Vehicle Stock. Kyle is a University of Illinois graduate in natural resources and environmental science with a master's degree from the Humboldt University in integrated natural resource management. He has been a researcher for the ICCT for the past 3 years. Well, take it away, Max.
Thank you, Professor Bruce Murray, for that introduction. And I guess to start, I just wanted to ask researcher Kyle Morrison, I guess, what is ICCT?
Yep. Thanks for the question, Max, and thanks for the introduction, Bruce. Both of you mentioned, my name is Kyle Morrison. I'm a researcher at the International Council on Clean Transportation, which spells out the acronym ICCT. So the ICCT is an independent nonprofit research organization. We are dedicated to providing unbiased technical and policy analysis, which seeks to aim to accelerate the transition towards clean transportation worldwide. And the ICCT works closely with governments, industry stakeholders, and NGOs to provide kind of more science-based policy recommendations on how we can accelerate this clean transition.
Awesome. So I guess what motivated you to pursue research with ICCT? From what I understand, you studied natural resources and environmental science, so there's some overlap there. But I guess why specifically research?
Yeah, I think research can be a really exciting pathway for your career. And I think especially with ICCT, where they have such kind of influence at local, national, and supranational government levels, I think a lot of the research at ICCT can be very influential, and you see a lot of kind of influence from these publications. Um, so yeah, we're kind of basically contributing a lot on a lot of different super complex issues that pertain to climate change, but then also global health at the various levels that I already mentioned. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think ICCT is a great place to kind of get that work done and to see a lot of results from the research.
Gotcha. Absolutely. I guess how was working with a research team and developing the roles of that research team?
Yeah, so working on a research team, I think, is always a super interesting and rewarding process, especially at ICCT. It's such an interdisciplinary organization where a lot of people have various skill sets. So for this paper that we already mentioned before, there's a lot of us with, different backgrounds and different knowledge sets that kind of really came together in a really useful way to create what I would say was like kind of a new unique publication for ICCT. So we kind of pulled together researchers who have kind of a general knowledge on the policy background, but then model developers, some of our more senior level staff, communications teams, external researchers who do reviews of our publications and things like that. So I think um, working with the team it's not just researchers, but it's all sorts of different types of backgrounds that are needed to kind of yeah, support this publication process.
Kyle, I'd like to jump in and ask at the ICCT, are the researchers encouraged to build teams on research topics themselves, or do they get assignments from leadership?
I would say it's both. So if there's a specific topic that like a funder of the ICCT wants kind of done, and one of our directors or senior level staffs kind of needs this specific project completed, then they would be kind of heavily involved in selecting different researchers and making sure that kind of all needs of the projects are met. But we also yeah, sort of can also come up with our own ideas for shorter publications like blogs or working papers, where maybe you, if you have a specific idea yourself, you can kind of, yeah, work with your colleagues. If you know that you want to work on a specific topic like e-fuels, then you might, recruit another researcher to review the paper or to edit it or something like that. So it can be both, I would say, depending on the specific publication.
Just a quick follow-up question. What was the case for the topic that we're conversing about today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the topic in general came up because our director, Peter Mock, I think he recognized almost 2 years ago when kind of the first steps of the publication process began, when just like the planning stages, I think he recognized that kind of with the acceptance of the European CO2 standards, that there would be kind of other future topics in transport that would be becoming more important, like the vehicle stock. And maybe just some background information for the listeners. The European CO2 standards for cars and trucks basically regulates the emissions at a fleet-wide level. Um, and it kind of works in this step-by-step process where every few years, the kind of requirements on tailpipe emissions for cars and trucks get more stringent. So basically, at a fleet-wide level, manufacturers have to kind of slowly but surely decarbonize and lower emissions from the cars that they're selling. So this really just affects new car registrations, but those were finalized, I think, 2 years ago. Yeah, sometime in 2022, basically requiring in 2035 that at a fleet-wide level, new cars cannot emit any carbon from the tailpipe. Um, so yeah, basically once that was finalized, it became clear that we needed to start focusing on other aspects that are still contributing to greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector.
Gotcha. So with that being said, I think I'd like to transition into maybe more specifics on the paper. Could you give us a brief summary of the paper that you wrote?
Yeah. So basically, the paper generally focused on this kind of question of the vehicle stock. So the vehicle stock basically means the cars that are already on the road. So not those new cars that I just mentioned earlier, which are registered and then start to drive. So this paper specifically only focused on the cars that everyone is already driving around, which can be a much more difficult task to regulate. So in Germany right now, there are about 49 million gas and diesel cars that are already on the road. And this is the largest passenger car market in the European Union. So the paper generally aims to identify different strategies that we can use to decarbonize those 49 million gas and diesel cars in Germany right now. So the specific instruments that we looked at was mainly a scrappage program. So if anyone who's listening isn't familiar, a scrappage program is basically a government-led program where certain cars that can be targeted within the program are kind of given a payment to the owner of the vehicle, and then they're taken off the road and either scrapped, which means yeah, destroyed, and the metals are used for other purposes, or potentially also exported to other markets outside of Germany. And then we also looked at e-fuels, which are synthetic fuels used with or created with renewable energy, which can potentially be used to decarbonize passenger cars. And then we also looked at modal shifts, so public transportation, active transportation, more dense city design, things like that. Um, and then lastly, we briefly looked at retrofitting, so kind of transforming an internal combustion engine vehicle to a battery electric vehicle, which basically means, yeah, removing the engine and inputting the kind of battery technologies into that kind of frame of the old car. Um, so yeah, that was generally the aim of the study and the quick summary. And I think our results basically showed that there isn't kind of one silver bullet to decarbonizing the passenger car stock. And generally, we recommend trying to accelerate battery electric vehicle uptake as much as possible to kind of prevent these stock emissions from ever existing. So that, yeah, that's basically the study in a nutshell, but we can get into more specific questions on the instruments.
Got it. So for anyone new that's joining us and listening in, I'm Max Zhu. I'm a University of Illinois student studying abroad in Vienna at the moment, and we're interviewing Professor Bruce Murray and researcher Kyle Morrison on Kyle's paper through ICCT, cleaning up Germany's vehicle stock. And we just had a quick introduction of everything, each one of us, and the general outline of the paper. And hopefully now we can get into some of the more specifics. So what was your inspiration to pursue this topic? I know you mentioned some of those regulations that have been getting more stringent through the years, but from my understanding, I think there were three main ones that I read into, were the EU's economy-wide reduction. Then you had the call for specifically new passenger car registrations to be zero emission by I think it was 2035. And then finally the Germany specific one, which was a transport wide target of 85 megatons by 2030.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a really good question. And I think generally we see with even all of these kind of instruments that are in place and climate targets, for example, with the phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035, of course, that's super important to have. But even with this phase out, we see that economies like Germany are going to likely miss their transportation targets. And so, yeah, Germany previously had a transport-wide target of 85 megatons of CO2 equivalent emissions. Germany kind of updated their climate targets to look at everything economy-wide, so they don't look at their emissions from a sector target anymore. But for this specific publication, we kind of estimated what or how much or greenhouse gas emissions would have to reduce by 2030 to align with this previous target. And it was clear that there was like quite a large gap between where Germany would be and where they need to be. So even with these CO2 standards and other measures at the local level in Germany, kind of promoting vehicle electrification and expanding public transit, that there was clearly more needed from the German government and also from the EU to kind of make sure that these climate targets are being met. Um, so yeah, generally, this is an important question that's now kind of being or starting to be considered at the German national level and also the EU level. So I think this kind of paper came at a really good time now that those CO2 standards were finalized and kind of secure.
I can imagine that when working on a project like this, when you get to the publication point, and then you see that, again, circumstances might begin to change, that keeps you focused on what you're doing and trying to figure out how best to proceed even post publication. And right now, the new EU Commission has just started its work, and we're learning more about how it might be proceeding with the European Green Deal, which creates kind of an umbrella for all of what we're talking about. And the German car industry is having some challenges right now, and companies like Volkswagen are in the news. Are you watching that, and is that influencing also a little bit of your thinking about the importance of what you have done so far and how to proceed?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely always important to be kind of keeping up to date on current policies or the news with what's going on with the auto industry. I think with this paper specifically, um, we didn't really kind of look much into the effects that a scrappage program, for example, could have on the auto industry. Like this wasn't a part of our like quantitative analysis, so we kind of qualitatively mentioned that there could be benefits for the auto industry if more people are buying electric cars due to a scrappage program. But really, the important aspects for us was kind of keeping that separate and just looking at how could a scrappage program be designed and what effects would this have on emissions. So I think that was really kind of the main motivation, and we definitely don't want to say that we need or want more cars on the road. It's just this is a kind of commonly discussed instrument that can be used from national governments. And so if it were to happen, I think we should look at the costs and benefits of where the costs are. Um, how much is the government paying out to people for their cars? And the benefits would be, how much damage is avoided from air pollution or for climate change. Um, and then as far as the kind of EU level aspects, this was especially important for the e-fuels aspect of the paper. So kind of looking at how many e-fuel or how much e-fuel would be available to decarbonize the passenger car fleet was really dependent on kind of these targets and multipliers at the EU level. So generally, our viewpoint is that with the current sort of legislations at the EU level, it's not really practical to have much e-fuel left over for passenger cars because most of the frameworks in the EU level kind of prioritize e-fuels for aviation and marine. Um, and so it was really important to kind of keep up to date and to also like kind of tap into our e-fuels experts who really are kind of aware of what's going on at the EU level as it pertains to e-fuels. So yeah, I think both sides, like OEMs and EU frameworks, were considered, but sort of in different ways.
So I guess speaking on the e-fuels, you wrote about, I think it was three, maybe four different solutions, or potential solutions to mitigating these greenhouse gases. Um, would you, sorry, would you like to speak a little bit about the first the vehicle scrappage program?
Yeah, so the vehicle scrappage program, I think what's kind of interesting about our program versus historical programs is that our program specifically targets vehicles by powertrain, so if they're gas or diesel, and by their age. And this is basically based on how much pollution is coming from each vehicle type and based on their age. So, as cars kind of progress, the types of engines and technology associated with those cars improves, and therefore pollution levels differ as the time frame goes on. Um, so our program was basically about kind of finding a cost-efficient way to get as many cars off the road as possible, while staying, in the green or staying cost effective. So we looked at climate and pollution damage functions and then kind of estimated based on traditional vehicle survival curves, like how many vehicle kilometers per year would this car be driving, and then kind of associating a different benefit based on their age or a payout based on their age. Um, and so we kind of estimated that with a 80% payment on a vehicle's residual value, that would likely be enough to motivate people to kind of give up their car and opt for, in a new electric vehicle or used electric vehicle or public transportation or active transportation. Um, and so I think, yeah, that was kind of more of a unique approach to scrappage programs because, like I mentioned, before, a lot of scrappage programs from countries just kind of have a single age limit, and it's more of kind of a program that benefits the car industry, something used during kind of economic crises like the cash for clunkers program in the US in 2000 after the 2008 financial crisis. So I think this program is kind of more specifically focused on reducing pollution and also accelerating the EV transition. Um, so it's kind of an overview of our scrappage program that we designed. And yeah, kind of switching then on to e-fuels, which I already mentioned before. We kind of looked at basically using other methodology from a previous ICCT publication. We looked at how much e-fuels would be available in 2030, and also how much would that cost versus gasoline, which would be kind of a typical fuel that those drivers would be using. And e-fuels can be used in internal combustion engine vehicles. Um, but basically, based on results of this previous ICC publication and the adopted methodology, we found that there would likely be very little e-fuels available to decarbonize the passenger car fleet, and that there would be significantly less greenhouse gas emissions kind of being removed from the fleet based on what e-fuels would be left in Germany during that time frame. And it would also be much more expensive. So it was generally not a practical approach to decarbonizing the stock. Um, and then, yeah, kind of lastly, we just did a qualitative literature review of avoid and shift measures, which avoid and shift generally means avoiding travel if it's possible, so not needing to use a car or any other form of transport. And then shifting would be kind of moving away from more polluting, kind of climate damaging forms of transportation, like driving a private gasoline car to something more sustainable. So like biking or driving with an electric car or um, yeah, riding with public transit on a train, something like that. So this was a qualitative literature review of studies that have already been published in Germany in 2030, and a lot of the emissions kind of vary based on the instruments, and also the costs to the governments vary based on avoid and shift instruments. So, for example, Germany doesn't have speed limits on many portions of its highways, as people famously know on the Autobahn. So there's potential to kind of reduce emissions from the stock by just implementing a speed limit. Um, I think the kind of most effective approach through avoid and shift strategies would be carbon pricing. So kind of internalizing the externalities of fossil fuels, using personal cars, for example, in the stock. But yeah, I think right now it's kind of a difficult time to discuss carbon pricing due to kind of higher inflation rates and cost of livings. Um, oh yeah, and lastly, we looked briefly at retrofitting, which is, yeah, like I mentioned before, is the transformation of an ICE EV to a BEV. Um, and this is right now, it seems less feasible, but there are kind of discussions going on about ways to kind of increase that efficiency of transforming the engine to a battery electric car. But in the paper, we kind of found that it's a bit preliminary and it might not be the best approach compared to other instruments.
Just briefly, I'm impressed with all of the thinking that has gone into what I think is an impressive proposal. When you mentioned the Cash for Clunkers program in the United States, it triggered memory of how when I'm in the United States, I also hear, for example, on NPR broadcasts, how people frequently are invited to donate their old cars. And it seems as though that also might be an option for getting cars off the road. And I don't know then if those cars that are donated are used for some kind of circular economy or scrappage project. And maybe none of us knows, but Kyle, if you know something about that or have any thoughts, I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting proposal, and I've definitely seen these kind of programs where people, donate their cars. I my guess would be that these are generally older cars that people probably don't use that much. So it's not a burden for them to just give it up as a donation without really any sort of financial benefit. I guess there could be maybe tax benefits later that someone would get. But my initial thoughts on this kind of bring up like a really important topic that we're now looking at ICCT, which is equity. And sort of how can this transition think about all people and not just those with, higher incomes or more privileged groups who can afford new cars quite easily. So I think that sort of question really that brings up this topic a lot in my mind because I think the ability to donate a car is largely based on how, well off you are. So a big consideration in our scrappage program was, okay, if we only pay 80%, will that be enough for certain people who might be really dependent on an old car and would say, okay, I can't, 80% is not enough for me to afford the purchase price of a new electric vehicle, which is, I think, a fair thing to say. So I think what's really important for Germany and other governments is to start to consider those people and their ways of movement and trying to bring both affordable and sustainable options to them, where it, might not be currently possible.
So in regard to that 80% of the residual value that you guys landed on, I was gonna say, like I feel like especially with consideration of new vehicle prices and specifically electric vehicle prices, that 80% might not be enough for say a family that isn't as well off. For one, I guess how did you and your team land on the 80% specifically? And for two, how do you think that uh you could combat maybe or find a solution for um, people that are less well off that maybe depend on their vehicle a little more.
Yeah, those are really good questions. I think the 80% value basically came at the point where we found the program to be cost effective. So I think if we had targeted the 100% residual value, then we would have a lot fewer cars kind of eligible for the program. Um, so I think I didn't mention this before, but the kind of gas car and diesel car age cutoff was significantly different because gas cars are generally hold their value more than diesel cars at an older age. And also diesel cars pollute a lot more. So there was more kind of benefit of removing them towards the cost. So yeah, basically that 80% value was where kind of like the sweet spot of the program. And it's a good point that maybe that wouldn't be enough for people with lower incomes. And this isn't something that we modeled or made part of like the quantitative analysis. But we did kind of qualitatively mention that there could be equity aspects if the German government were to consider a program like this. So maybe including some sort of extra bonus for people with lower incomes on top of that 80% of the depreciated vehicle value. And this also kind of brings up the discussion of the role that OEMs would play in a scrappage program. Generally, when there's any sort of kind of instrument that's put forward by a government, and it would have a benefit for the auto industry, then they would potentially pay a share of those costs. So, for example, the Umwelt bonus, which was previously the environmental bonus for the purchase of an electric car in Germany, a portion of that was paid for by the auto industry. So we could envision that if the auto industry saw this program as something that would benefit them, that they would probably also pay a share of the costs. So that could actually, potentially bump up the depreciated value cost up to 100% or more, depending on what sort of role that the auto industry would play.
Gotcha. Okay, interesting. And then I had a follow-up question regarding the e-fuel section as well. So from, I believe what you said that the e-fuels are compatible with combustion engines. just already?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So like generally e-fuels could be like viewed as like a replacement for gasoline or diesel. So that essentially your combustion engine car could still run the way it normally runs. You would just be fueling with e-fuels instead of gasoline or diesel. But I think it's really important to mention that e-fuels still contribute a lot to air pollution. So at the local level, you would still see kind of damages based on the pollutants coming out of the tailpipe, which was like a big part of the cost and benefit analysis in the scrappage program. So of course you have the climate benefits that e-fuels could, in theory, provide, even though there would likely be very little e-fuels available. Um, but a lot of the benefits to society that we see from scrapping a diesel or gas car are coming from those air pollutants. So yeah, essentially, if you want to fight air pollution and climate change at the same time, e-fuels aren't necessarily the best approach.
Interesting. And then for e-fuels, you're saying the availability of e-fuels themselves was also a bottleneck. Is the process of producing e-fuels, transporting e-fuels, is that a very heavily heavy with emission process too? Because like for example, like if the e-fuels aren't as dense in say like energy as gases and you're transporting and it takes more effort to transport or produce, is that also another side that might not make e-fuels as favorable?
I think it definitely plays a role. I'm not an expert on the kind of emissions that come from transporting e-fuels. I know that we predict a lot of the e-fuels that will be kind of used in Germany will come from countries that have a high potential for renewable energy production. So I think Egypt and Brazil are kind of commonly quoted as places where they think a lot of e-fuels will be produced due to the availability of solar energy in those countries. So I can't really say necessarily how much emissions are coming from transporting it. I think it wouldn't be negligible, but I think really the bottleneck is mostly that there just won't be enough produced to satisfy the needs of 49 million cars. And, there's many more across the EU and across the world. And I think the important thing is looking at those sectors that are difficult to decarbonize, like aviation or marine, where, a passenger airplane can't easily, function with a battery. It's generally not practical. So we kind of need to use the few e-fuels that are available for those sectors. Whereas with passenger cars, you can generally just electrify the fleet, or invest in avoid and shift, and that will be more cost effective, um, and just generally more effective in terms of the environment and human health.
Gotcha. And then in shifting to electrifying the fleet, I think a big problem that's been thrown around is disposal of the batteries after their lifetime has been used up. I guess what solutions are there with disposal of batteries? How important is proper disposal of batteries?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I'm not a battery expert, but I think a lot of what I've heard from others who work on this topic more at ICCT is generally that battery technology is improving a lot. And also the ability to recycle batteries is improving a lot. So, yeah, maybe in the past, like electric cars there has been sort of a question of what can we do with the battery when it's kind of at towards the end of its life. But I think there are kind of new approaches to reutilizing the resources when it's possible, to kind of, reduce the impacts, that battery production can have on the environment.
Traveling in Europe late this summer, I also saw in some cases e-charging stations, maybe at rest stops, that included solar generation on the roof of the e-charging facility and a building over to one side where there were packaged batteries that were used to store the solar on site for the e-charging. It seems as though in a circular economy, that also is something that might be scaled up for including the use of old e-vehicle batteries that still have a good capacity to store energy.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not so familiar with that, but I think definitely looking at as many ways as possible to increase circularity is going to be really important. Yeah, to just kind of reduce our carbon footprint or our footprint on the environment as much as possible. And I think it's interesting to mention that one of the main criticisms that or yeah, not criticisms, but I would say misconceptions on electric cars is that the kind of energy productions at their current levels is somehow still kind of the same or worse than gas or diesel cars. But I think a lot of our analyses that look at the grid and how we're producing energy, that we still see major benefits to the climate and major reductions across almost every major economy, no matter how much fossil fuel or renewable energy fuels are in the kind of energy production mix. So looking at ways to maximize that is like key as as we're approaching 2025. And yeah, so we kind of need to optimize as much as possible, but already starting with electrification and building out the charging infrastructure grid is super important.
Awesome. So I guess as a little wrap up of the different solutions that you and your team researched and looked into, were you surprised by any of your findings? I know the vehicle scrappage program is specifically is a little bit of a unique take on maybe a solution. But yeah, I guess were you surprised by your findings? And specifically, I'm curious about that scrappage program.
Yeah. So I would say no, we weren't necessarily surprised. I think the general idea was to design a program that was cost effective. So we knew that we were going to kind of come out with this output. Um, I think maybe the only thing that surprised me was like how many cars could be a part of such a program. And obviously, the way we create a hypothetical program is not how it's always going to be occurring in real life. And like I mentioned before, we also don't want to be saying we're removing all the cars off the road. Um, but yeah, I think the scale of what could be included in such a program was something that was like, okay, this could be huge. Um, but um, yeah, in the end, I think the overall message, which was more or less, I wouldn't say was a surprise, but not what I exactly expected, was that there is kind of no one way to decarbonize the stock, and that there have to be, unfortunately, like many a multi-pronged approach to tackling this issue because there are a lot of kind of complex factors that go into evaluating stock emissions, and so it's there's no easy solution to this problem.
Right, of course. I guess going back to the whole paper research writing side of things, after publishing the paper, did you have a chance to present your research to anybody else, maybe policymakers or other researchers? And I guess like what does that process typically look like?
Yeah. So generally with like most of our publications, we do outreach to journalists, which we loop in our communications team a lot because they're really the experts on how we should kind of communicate scientific research to, yeah, the media or to the general public who will be reading these publications. So we kind of present our results in that way, making sure kind of to avoid, scientific jargon, and really honing the message that we want to put out. Um, but we also, of course, work with governments and ministries, presenting our results in that way. And then we also, of course, attend conferences where we can, share our results and kind of exchange with other research organizations and researchers. So I think, yeah, there's kind of many different ways that we present our paper, and each approach is kind of a little bit different, just depending on the goal.
Are you receiving some feedback now that maybe pleases you and motivates you to continue? And has there been any critical feedback?
Um, yeah, I think it's I mean the media outreach was really good. So our comps team, they always do a great job. So we had a lot of kind of interest in the paper from the media. So that was something really motivating that this is kind of a topic that's gaining a lot of attention. Um, and I think there were some criticisms of the e-fuel section, but that's generally kind of certain organizations I think have a different view of how we should decarbonize the stock. But I think kind of based on our analysis, it's quite clear, what is the most feasible.
Let's see, where are we? Um, okay. I think for now, I think we could start moving into like general final statements, maybe start closing things up. Um, I don't know, Bruce, do you have anything to add, I guess, for the second block of the that interview section?
It has been exciting and inspiring to listen to younger people like Kyle and Max getting into the weeds on a topic like this, thinking about the various aspects of the research and looking at a variety of ways to solve the research problem, and not only to stop then with publishing the results, but looking for ways to disseminate and to facilitate implementation. It has been a pleasure for me to participate in this conversation and to learn along the way. I'd like to congratulate both of you on your work and really encourage you to continue it. And I know you're going to do that, and I can't wait to see what you do.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Let's see. I think, yeah. I mean, maybe we get some final questions with Kyle on the paper, and then I think that's about everything that I mean I meant to and wanted to talk about so far. Um, let's see. Yeah, okay. I guess back into interview mode, but how crucial do you believe, I guess, the mitigation of carbon emissions for the future is of, humanity in general? There's a lot of different projections, a lot of different climate models, a lot of different opinions even on, what to do now, what's the future has in store, and I guess what specifically do you believe, what areas specifically do you believe need the most reform? Of course, you wrote the paper on vehicle stock, but we also spoke a little about using e-fuels and say aviation and shipping. Yeah, I guess what are your opinions on that?
Yeah, I think, yeah, obviously climate mitigation is just absolutely critical. There's no other way that we can really exist in a world where we're radically going towards a climate disaster or climate crisis, where we're already seeing the impacts now with the recent flooding in Valencia or, hurricanes in North Carolina in the US. All across the world, we're seeing extreme weather events, and it's really just the beginning. So it's only going to get worse. So I think in every sense of the way that we're emitting carbon, we need to kind of drastically envision a new future where greenhouse gases are, yeah, not being released just for, the sake of transportation or the economy. We really need to kind of think of this as like a human survival problem because that's what it is. So, my focus is on the transportation sector and the road transport sector. And I think to answer your question of what's the most important to focus on, that really depends kind of the region that you're looking at. So, of course, Europe is moving towards, new car registrations being, 0 grams of CO2 from the tailpipe. so I think for Europe, a big focus should be then, the vehicle stock and other sectors that might be higher emitting, like heavy duty vehicles, trucks, planes. But then I think in markets like in the US, where now with the election of Donald Trump, the kind of CO2 standards that were formalized under the Biden administration, I think working to kind of keep those in place, if not at the federal level, then at a wider state level is really important because, as we've seen, or as I've mentioned, once gas and diesel cars enter the stock, it can be really difficult to get them out and to get them to stop polluting. So it's best to just avoid those emissions in the first place. So I think it really depends where you're looking at. And we need to also be looking at strategies to kind of leapfrog the sort of carbon bubble in developing countries where, some countries are just starting to set up their kind of industries. And I think the global north needs to kind of foot the bill for helping to kind of reduce carbon dependencies in these countries that might just be getting started to develop. So really a lot of global collaboration, a lot of global cooperation is really needed to tackle climate change because it's a super complex, difficult problem. And I think that's the only way that we can really yeah, see or make progress on this problem at least is through cooperation and targeted approaches.
One of the things I heard that I began thinking more about is that modal shift aspect of what you're proposing. And I'm thinking too about how during the next 4 years in the United States, there might be an increased focus on state and local initiatives, including cities. And it seems to me one option is to think about the scrappage program not as something that will only lead to a transition to an e-vehicle use, but also to no vehicle use. As you mentioned, more public transportation. And where I am sitting here in Vienna, there are densely populated areas of the city where there is an effort to get more cars off the streets. One option has been to provide discounted parking spaces in garages. And one surprise result of implementing that has, in one of the districts in Vienna, led to a 25% decrease in the number of automobiles in the district, period. Uh, I'm thinking also with that equity component in mind that the scrappage proposal could perhaps include some kind of subsidy in a desire to have people say, I'm not going to use what I get for a car, but for a monthly public transportation pass, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, that's actually something we briefly talk about in the paper, is that number one, the climate benefits and the total benefits to society would be much higher if someone didn't adopt even an electric car after they gave up their previous car. So, because there's still materials required to build an electric car that cause emissions, and then also there's the kind of benefits to the individual. If you are more reliant on active transit or public transit, you have those kind of health benefits of moving more versus just sitting in the car. So I think it's definitely good to kind of also bring forward this discussion on avoid and shift and active transportation and public transit because really that is the most sustainable way to move around. And I think a lot of cities are really starting to value this approach to kind of a more dense city design or a 15-minute city concept where you can access basically all of your daily needs within a 15-minute radius of walking radius. So I think a lot of cities are really pushing to expand their public transportation networks, kind of prioritizing bike lanes and protected bike lanes. So I think that's really good to see, and I hope it continues.
I think that's interesting in regard to the avoid and shift, where it's almost like a personal responsibility that we all have to take on as individuals. maybe choosing to bike when driving might be a little easier or save a little more time, or even, traveling here. I've been in Vienna for this past semester, but traveling around and maybe choosing to take the train instead of flying when it might take longer or the times may not be as convenient. And I guess, what do you think and what do you do yourself, not to put you on the spot, but I guess, what do you feel your responsibility is as an individual for the future?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question that a lot of like environmental researchers might disagree on, or environmentalists who might not work in research, is to kind of who to put the blame on, or is it in the individual, and or is it, rather, the fossil fuel companies to blame, or governments? And I think the kind of uh, boring answer, or yeah, less controversial answer, which I believe is that it's kind of a systems approach, and everyone who plays a role in this system needs to kind of make a change. So, of course, individuals choosing to use public transit or biking over flying or cars is always going to have that benefit. But I think that's not to say that, corporations or governments are therefore off the hook. I think everyone needs to kind of be moving towards a more sustainable zero emission future. And that means making the right choices as an individual, but then also, using your votes and your voices to pressure governments to kind of have these critical regulations that will attempt to minimize any sort of like climate disaster. So I think it's um, yeah, I think we should be looking at it from like every level instead of one or the other. I think that's the most effective way that we'll see results.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I think is that everything then? I'm all good on my end. Maybe we just do like a final thank you. And then we can stop the recording and then maybe chat a little afterwards.
Okay.
Bruce, do you have anything else to add?
I'm, as I mentioned, excited to watch what you do moving forward, Max, as you move towards graduation and take your next steps. And Kyle, I'm going to be looking at the ICCT site for uh, more publications. It seems like ICCT has a really robust system, and there are publications coming out regularly. And I want to, as you said, take a systems approach personally, influencing my behavior, and also looking for ways as a voter and in other ways as a global citizen to participate in the process of implementing solutions. And as Antonio Guterres said, getting off that climate highway to hell as fast as possible, especially between now and 2030.
Yeah, I think it's totally it's the only way forward. So I'm glad to hear that there's interest, and that yeah, excited to see kind of what progress we make in the future.
Awesome. It was nice talking to everybody, and for anyone else listening, thank you, Kyle, for taking the time out of your day to have this interview. And of course, the paper was really interesting, and I wish you luck on any future projects or endeavors. And again, Bruce, thank you for that introduction and also helping me set up this whole interview process.
Yep. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me.